Hi everyone, this is an overview video of some new functionality in Navision for service call issue tracking. So, as everyone knows, customer follow-ups are an important part of our business, and everyone's aware of the urgency to give customers frequent updates. But one of our biggest obstacles to giving customers timely updates is tracking open issues and getting timely updates and information from our vendors. And so we need to proactively pester vendors about the status of lingering service call issues, and our team's been making many separate phone calls to vendors about separate issues on separate service calls. We've also been sending vendors lots of email requests and reminders, both manually and automatically generated from the system. And all those calls and emails have been inefficient for us and annoying to the vendors. And it hasn't been practical to contact a vendor once per day, let's say, to talk about all the open issues across all calls, because it would require finding all open calls for that vendor and then sifting through all the call notes and call event entries to pull together that information. So how do we deal with this? Well, one of the things that we've done, and we're going to show it to you here shortly, is to add some new features to Navision for tracking what we'll call issues, which could be either event notes or event entries that get generated automatically from the system that are in the event notes list that we're going to tag as vendor and or customer issues. And that will allow us to open a screen in Navision that lets us see an overview of all the open issues for a particular vendor or customer at one time. And that can be the basis for a daily phone call with a vendor, or even if it happens to be an ad hoc call where you call the vendor or they call in, it gives you a quick way to pop open a list of all the issues that we have across all calls with that vendor in order to have a discussion about those open issues. And if the vendor should say, well, I'm kind of busy right now to talk through all these issues, could you email that list to me and we can talk about it later, then you can go ahead and do that. Email a complete list of all those open issues very easily. So what I'm going to do is walk through how that works with you. So I have two test calls here that I've created where the customer is Cornell Storefront Systems. I actually have two locations, one for here at Maffett Street, and I've got another service location set up for Mountaintop. And I have a couple of test vendors that I created. One is called Cornell Storefront Systems, and one is called Cornell Storefront Systems 2. And as you can see on this first call, I have a couple of POs to Cornell Storefront Systems Inc., the vendor, the primary vendor on this call. And down below in the call notes, you can see that I have a manual entry that I made here. This is the first issue on the call. This is the second issue on the call. And I have a system-generated event entry here about us waiting on photos when the call was changed to a WOP, waiting on photos stage. So we have some new fields here, a new column, issue status, vendor number, vendor name, issue closed, date and time. But if I need to track these three entries, or I'd like to track these three entries as open vendor issues, what I can do is click on my drop-down list button here and select the status code for open vendor issue. I get a little pop-up message here, a note telling me that the system by default selected the primary vendor number. Please change the number if different. So if there happen to be two different vendors on POs on this call and this issue was not for the primary vendor, then what I could do is just go ahead and key in or look up and enter the correct vendor number here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and make all three of these open vendor issues. So we now have three open vendor issues for Cornell Storefront Systems Inc., the vendor, on this call. And on the other call that I had here in the background, I had already gone ahead and done that. I already tagged a number of entries here as open vendor issues. But as you notice, on this call, we have two vendors. We have Cornell Storefront Systems and Cornell Storefront Systems 2, and we've got open issues with both vendors on this call. So I have some open issues on one call for one vendor. I've got some open issues on another call for another vendor. And if I now would like to see an overview list of all the open issues across all calls, I can go to the vendor card, let's drill in here to the vendor list, open the vendor card, and on the vendor card vendor sub-menu here at the bottom, at the very end of this menu list, there's a new option called Service Follow-Up Issues. And if I select that, I get a new screen or window here in Navision called Service Follow-Up Issues. It summarizes all of the open issues across all calls for this particular vendor, Cornell Storefront Systems, Inc. If I go over to the other call, or the other vendor, I'm sorry, and do a lookup on that vendor card and show the service follow-up issues, and we can see that we have 2 issues on one call for this vendor. So let's go back to the other call again, and let's assume that we have either an incoming phone call to the vendor, or we needed to call the vendor about something on this particular call. While I have the vendor on the phone, what I could do is open up their vendor card, display their open service issues, and I have them all in front of me that I could have for basis of discussion about the open issues that we have across all calls if the vendor has time to talk about them. Now, if the vendor says, hey, I'm pretty busy, I don't really have time to talk about all these issues right now, can you send me an email listing all the issues? Well, in that case, what you can do is come down here on the Service Follow-Up Issues screen to the Functions menu and select the first option here, Email List to Vendor. And Navision opens an email message. Cornell Storefront Service Call Open Issues as of today's date and time. Dear John Janicek, the contact for this vendor. Following is a list of open work order issues for Cornell Storefront Systems as of today's date and time. Please address and advise us of the status of these issues as soon as possible, and it lists all of the open issues call by call. If I need to add something to this message or edit it in any way or add another email address here for CC, I can do that before sending it off. Go ahead and send it out to the vendor. So that could be the basis, again, for, depending on our process, for a daily phone call with a vendor. Or we could just do it on an ad hoc basis. Whenever we happen to have a conversation or make a phone call to a vendor, we could send a vendor that list of issues. Something we talked about was perhaps having vendor relations do a mass emailing to all vendors every day, let's say first thing in the morning. And the way that they could do that would be to come to Service Follow-Up Issues screen on the Vendor Relations menu, and they will get a list summarizing all the open issues across all calls for all vendors. You can see here that we have the issues that were pertinent to Cornell Storefront Systems, and we have the issues that were pertinent to Cornell Storefront Systems 2 across the multiple calls. And what Vendor Relations can do is click on the second option here from the Functions menu, Batch Email All Vendors. And when you click on that, you get a little warning that says this will generate and send issue list emails to all vendors. Are you sure? I'm not going to go ahead and do that right now, but if I did, it would go ahead and generate an email. It won't pop open a separate email for editing for each vendor in that case, because at some point in using this, the list could be very lengthy, and so this batch email is designed to really just go ahead and send off a list without any editing or interaction, and that's the way that that would work. So having said that, it's important to keep in mind that what's going to appear in those emails is going to be exactly what was keyed in the event log, and so it's going to be important to think about the verbiage and the wording of these entries when they're tagged as open vendor issues, because whatever is written there in those event notes is exactly what's going to or be carried over into those email messages. Another feature that I wanted to point out here was that you might have situations where you want to track certain entries or event notes or issues on a call that are certainly things you need to keep the customer updated about, but that aren't necessarily a vendor problem. And when you have that situation, you can either take an existing event entry note or a new one and give it an issue status of open customer. Now, when you give it an open customer tag, then if you go to a list or do a filtered list of open issues by customer, then you'll be able to just see the issues that are not vendor related but that are customer related. Now there'll be many situations obviously where it's both. So you have open vendor issues that are certainly impacting the customer and that you need to update the customer about. So when that's the situation, you can select issue status code of open both. And whether or not you select an issue status of open customer, you can at any time come to the Sales CRM tab on a call and look at the open issues either for a particular call, or if I were to go to the customer card, in the same way that on the vendor card we have an option for viewing vendor issues, we have an option on the customer card for viewing customer follow-up issues. So this is going to show all open issues with this customer regardless of whether we tag those entries or not. But I just wanted to point out that there are a number of different ways to access this information by customer, by vendor. On the Sales CRM tab, we have an Open Issues button that will show you the issues list on a call-by-call basis. On the Vendor tab, we have an Open Vendor Issues button that will show all of the open issues for the vendor that you happen to have selected on the vendor section of the Vendor tab here. So to go over to the other call, for example, if I happen to be selected on the first vendor here, which is Cornell Storefront Systems, Inc., and look at the open vendor issues, there are the issues for the first Cornell Storefront Systems vendor. If I select on the line that has Cornell Storefront Systems 2 as the vendor and open vendor issues, then I'm just going to see the couple of issues for that vendor. So that's an overview. Obviously, this is only going to be effective if, number one, whenever we have an issue that we would like to be able to report to a vendor and or track, we're going to need to go ahead and remember to tag these event entries as an open vendor issue or open both. And obviously be a little bit cautious about the verbiage and wording of these entries that are tagged as vendor issues. And something else we'll need to keep in mind is that until an entry is marked as closed, so in this case, if we were to close the couple of issues we have here with Cornell Storefront Systems Inc. 2, then we should come in and mark that record as closed vendor, closed vendor. And you can see that the system will timestamp the date and time that the issue is closed. But given that these couple of issues are now closed, they would no longer appear in the open vendors issues list and would also be excluded from the emails. So there's quite a bit more that we can do with this, but just wanted to give you this quick overview of this new functionality that hopefully will help us address the root cause of timely customer follow-ups, which happens to be having a more effective way to track open vendor issues and talk to vendors about those issues and get updates from vendors on the status of those issues so that we can update customers.